Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the concept presentations we've developed for the Mellon Park Action Plan. My name is Brandon Riley. I'm the Capital Projects Manager here at Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, and I'm the project lead on this. As mentioned to some of you folks who joined a little early, this is a pretty long presentation. It's going to run about 2 hours. We'll take some breaks in between, but now would be a good time to grab a water, run to the bathroom, get a snack, or whatever you need to do to get yourself comfortable, because we have a lot of information, a lot of things to cover. We've been pretty busy the past few months. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about tonight, first, we're going to just kind of do a very brief introduction and overview of the project, just to sort of remind folks what the action plan is, or if this is your first meeting with us, to kind of bring you up to speed. We're going to report out on what we heard during the listening sessions that we did. And that was the previous public meetings, focus groups, and the online survey. We'll let you know the trends and kind of the general feedback we received. And then we will present concepts. So first we'll present what we're calling our overall park improvements, traffic and pedestrian safety improvements we're proposing, and some stormwater management strategies. We will take a break then and kind of talk about those things, go into breakout rooms to discuss in more detail, get some feedback. And then we'll go through some design options for certain areas of the park and discuss things in a little more detail, and we'll break out into breakout sessions again, get feedback, and then if we have time at the end, we can sort of wrap it up and have an open discussion. So just a reminder of who we are and what we're doing here. Again, my name is Brandon Riley. I'm the project lead with the Parks Conservancy. I'm joined by Catherine Hunanen, our Senior Manager of Special Initiatives, Aaron Tobin, our Community Engagement Manager, and Caitlin Steve, our Community Engagement Coordinator. And that wraps up the Parks Conservancy team that is leading this planning effort. But we also have a number of consultants who are helping us out on this project. We have Cosmos Technologies and Evolve EA, and Claudia Saladin is joining us from Evolve EA. They're our stormwater engineer and designers. Gateway Engineers is working on kind of traffic and pedestrian safety. They're not joining us tonight, but we'll show you some of the work they've done. And then Foreground Consulting is our historic landscape and kind of cultural landscape consultant. And Susan Rademacher from Foreground is joining us today as well. But we're working in close partnership with the city of Pittsburgh and the various departments that have a stake in Mellon Park, as well as an advisory committee that includes not only some of the department heads of those city agencies, but a number of other city agencies like PWSA, Alcosan, Port Authority, Friends of Mellon Park, and a large number of community organizations that have been kind of guiding us throughout this process. So what are the goals of the action plan? What is the action plan? Why are we here? So just a reminder, the goals of the action plan is, one, to create a unifying vision for Mellon Park, both halves, to treat both sides of the park under the same lens and treat it as an entire park. Right now, they feel very separate. They're treated very differently. Many people don't even realize that they're the same place. So we want to create a unifying vision that's going to guide any improvements of Mellon Park into the future. That this plan is also going to kind of digest and understand and prioritize what those future improvements should be based on funding availability, benefits to the park, as well as community input, community engagement. What do you want to see happen first? And then we can sort of create a roadmap for how these improvements should be rolled out over the course of 5, 10, 15 years, however long it takes to implement the action plan. We also want to leverage other projects, meaning any other projects that could be happening in and around Mellon Park, be they headed up, be it infrastructure projects by PWSA or roadway projects by DOMI. We want to leverage those, identify and leverage those projects in a way that can bring benefit to Mellon Park. And if there's an opportunity to coordinate projects, do cost sharing, et cetera, identify that and work that into the plan. We also want to focus on equity and inclusion. Mellon Park is at the center of 6 different neighborhoods, many of them diverse, with varying backgrounds. So it's a home to a large, diverse section of the city. So we want to make sure that all of those neighborhoods, all of those park users, all of those communities are equally represented and their voices are heard in this process. And lastly, we want to make sure this is a community-driven process, meaning whatever improvements, plans, concepts that are developed, they need community buy-in, community support, and it needs to be based on community feedback. This is your park at the end of the day, and what we propose needs to be supported by you all. We want you all on board. We want park advocates, and that's really how this is going to be a successful project in the long run. So, very quick on project schedule and where we are in the timeline of this project. So we spent pretty significant portion of time, January through August, in what we call the listen and analyze phase. That's where we kind of did our site analysis of the site, but we also did a number of community engagement sessions to really get people's feedback and understand how you use the park, what things you like, what things you don't like, what do you see the future of Mellon Park being? So that included a number of advisory committee meetings, 3 community public meetings, 6 design charrettes and or focus groups, as well as a survey that was released to gather all that feedback. Right now, we're in what's called the ideate phase, which is where we took all of that information, we chewed on it, we analyzed it, and we came up with some design solutions to address some of the problems and issues raised. So we are kind of at the, right now we are here. So this is our 3rd community meeting that we've had this week, which will kind of wrap up that community engagement session. We are going to release a survey about these concepts online on the Engage PGH website to get additional feedback, as well as some additional workshops, focus groups, and charrettes based on what we hear from you folks as being hot, specific items that need clarification. We're going to take all of that information. We're going to refine our concepts into a preferred plan, and we'll probably be ready to present that to you folks again in January, sometime around there. And then we'll do the whole thing over again. So we'll have multiple community meetings, we'll have focus groups, we'll have an online survey to make sure we're getting as much feedback as we can. After that, sometime in early spring, late winter, we'll begin developing the final action plan. And again, this would be posted up online or disseminated to the community to get the draft version to get your feedback. And then we'll be wrapping it up hopefully by the end of May 2022. So, as I mentioned, we did a number of community engagement efforts. We had over 850 survey responses, 6 focus group meetings on various different issues such as safety and access, dog parks, stormwater, et cetera, and multiple stakeholder meetings with various stakeholders, be they city agencies or the Ellis School, or other individual entities in and around Mellon Park that have a vested interest in the park, to understand how they use the park, what their thoughts are, et cetera. So what we heard and who we heard from, these graphs give you kind of a general sense of how the survey information played out. So we got a strong showing a lot of responses from Point Breeze, Shady Side, and Squirrel Hill, those neighborhoods, as well as a lot of people responding to the survey from other. So that could be people from Regent Square, the North Side who use the park, or even outside of the city of Pittsburgh itself. We did not have as strong of a showing from neighborhoods East Liberty, Homewood, Larimer, and North Point Breeze, or Point Breeze North, excuse me. We got about 100 surveys from those neighborhood areas out of the 850 responses we received. We know we have to do better, and we're going to focus on trying to do better going forward. We kind of extended our engagement sessions to try and target those neighborhoods specifically. The good news is a lot of the 100 responses we did receive, there wasn't anything wildly out of character or out of touch with the rest of the survey responses. Everything was kind of consistent with what most people have brought forward with their responses. So that gives us some level of confidence with what we're proposing. Additionally, in terms of park breakdown, it's kind of split down the middle. This represents the number of people who use the north side of the park exclusively. This color here represents the number of people who use the south side, and this green color here is people who use both sides equally. So when you kind of break it out, it's a pretty good 50-50 representation of park users, especially which side they use. So that's good. It means it wasn't weighted one way or the other in terms of the survey responses we received. And also what was good is we got a very good kind of generational breakdown of park users of all different age groups. A lot of times you'll either get a lot of older folks or a lot of young families, but this is a pretty good breakdown of people who use the parks or who answered a survey on behalf of someone who's 5 and under. But it really shows that it's a multi-generational park, and that we got that feedback as well to back that up. So what we're going to do now is just kind of outline some of the overall sort of high level themes that we heard throughout the survey process. Obviously, we've got more detailed responses, but these are the main things that, kind of across the board were cited the most often. So park-wide issues, things that are, are true for both sides of the park, affect the park as a whole. Parking and access were basically like one of the number 1 and 2 responses we got. Parking is difficult on both sides of the park, and access to the park, especially pedestrian access, is also difficult. Fifth Avenue, Penn Ave, Shady Ave, and to some extent Beechwood, traffic is difficult, and it's not safe for pedestrians or even cyclists to try and access the park from those areas. So finding ways to improve parking and access was one of the main comments we got almost universally on all the surveys. Wayfinding and signage, again, on both sides of the park. A lot of the park entrances aren't signed. A lot of people don't realize the south portion of the park is actually a park because there's very little signage. And when you're in the park, there's no wayfinding. There's no map telling you where all the amenities are and how to get from point A to point B. So people sort of figure it out on their own, but it's not as effective as it could be. More park amenities. That was something a lot of people also mentioned wanting to see. So benches, tables, bike racks, picnic shelters, etc. There are some out there now, but they tend to be clustered in certain areas. So there are some parts of the park that there are no benches. So adding those amenities was important to a lot of folks. More events, programming, and art in the park. So we had a lot of surveys that people either said they really like the events in Mellon Park, the events that are currently held there. That's one of the reasons they go. They like to see that continue. They like to see events that used to be held in Mellon Park brought back. And some people wanted to see more events, especially culturally diverse events. There was a question on the survey about what could be done in Mellon Park to help unite East End residents of all different ages, ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, etc. And events and programming were basically the main response to how people envisioned that. Having more diverse culturally diverse events on both sides of the park could really help bring people together and create more shared experience amongst the varied neighborhoods around Mellon Park. Off-leash dogs was another big topic that came up. Half the people for them, half of the responses were against them. We know it's an issue in the park that needs some resolution, so that's something our plans explored. And then respecting the landscape of Mellon Park on both sides, the history of the park, the trees. That was something a lot of people said they like Mellon Park because of the natural beauty and the natural peacefulness and open space that it offers. So making sure whatever we're doing is respectful of that. Excuse me. Jumping over to Mellon Park North issues, these are really issues that are kind of specific to the north half of the park. We mentioned it in the previous slide, but parking needs to be mentioned again, specifically in the north side. The existing lot that's there is undersized. It's very chaotic, especially when there's a lot of activity going on in the park. There's a bike lane going through it. There's pedestrians trying to cross. There's cars double parked. So addressing the need for not only more parking, but a safer kind of parking interface in the park was a huge comment we got. Practice space for football, soccer, and cheer and other sports. Baseball kind of dominates the north side of the park. There's 3 baseball fields. They typically get preferred kind of for the permitting. They typically get precedence for permitting. So most of these other sports groups just want a place to practice, and they often get kind of pushed off the field if there's a baseball game. They're just trying to find a place for the kids to practice. So trying to carve out some space for that was something we heard a lot of. An event or performance space. The south side has some event and performance spaces, over where the old Mellon estate was on top of the hill. And while events do take place on the north side, there's really no designated event space. So there's no space that's really designed to accommodate that kind of activity. We just make do with what we've got, but having something that's a little more focused on hosting events on the north side was important. Field upgrades and access, just generally upgrading the fields, upgrading drainage, upgrading amenities. A lot of comments about field usage, that if you go to a field in the suburbs, the quality that teams experience there is night and day compared to what teams are used to playing on within the city. So how do we upgrade the level of quality of our field, the fields that we're offering, as well as access? We'll talk about that a little bit on the next two slides, but getting field time is difficult, and how do we improve that so everyone gets equal use of the fields? Improved tennis bubble access. So a lot of survey responses, including tennis users, say access to the tennis bubble is difficult. It's hard to reserve court time. People aren't exactly sure how to reserve court time. Once they get there, they're not exactly sure how they access the tennis bubble. And sometimes when they access the tennis bubble, they don't feel welcome being there. So how do we improve access to the tennis bubble, make it feel more open, more public? It's a public amenity, and making sure everyone feels welcome and can use that public facility. And then expanded playground splash pad. These are two areas, these two amenities are some of the most popular on the north side. If you're here on a summer evening, they're absolutely swarming with children. It's a great family atmosphere. It's a great experience for kids, and people want more of that. They want to see that expanded if possible. Jumping over to the south side, terrace garden repair was the number one response, the number one issue people brought up on the south side. If you go to the terrace garden, you'll notice that it's in a rather deteriorated state. It's not only unsightly in some areas, but it's actually unsafe. There's literal walls that are starting to collapse. So repairing the terrace garden, stabilizing it, restoring it, whatever we have to do, but addressing the terrace garden was the number one response for the south side. Bathrooms. There are no public bathrooms, at least that most people are aware of, on the south side, other than the occasional porta potty that gets brought in for an event. So how do we incorporate a restroom facility on the south side, since it's used heavily for events or just everyday use? Better use of the buildings, or what we're kind of terming the arts campus. That includes the Marshall Mansion, the big yellow building, the SCAFE building where Center for the Arts is currently located, the Garden Center, and the DPW garage. A lot of people like the events or the programs that are run out of those buildings. They want to see more of them, or some of them brought back. But there are a lot of questions about what's the fate of these buildings? What's the future of these buildings? Can they be used more effectively? And can they be better integrated into the park? Right now, they kind of read as a separate thing. So can we increase usership, access, but also make them feel like part of Mellon Park? Making this half of the park more inviting, but also respecting the historic character. So a number of folks, myself included, the first time I visited Mellon Park, don't realize the southern half of the park is a park. And part of that is due to some of the historic fencing that exists along the edges. It doesn't read as a park necessarily. It reads as a private estate, an institution, a museum, etc. So how do we make this half of the park feel more inviting, make it look like it's a public park intuitively, but also respecting that beautiful historic fences and art and infrastructure that we have in place, and enhancing existing event spaces. So we know this half of the park gets used for Fair in the Park or Beethoven Bach and Brunch and some larger events. And again, it works well, and we kind of make do with the space we have. But what kind of targeted interventions can we make that could make facilitating events run smoother? Make sure that it's protecting park infrastructure and avoiding damage from events. So how do we just kind of accommodate that existing use in a better way? And then improving the Shady Avenue connection, like I was kind of alluding to, the arts campus where those buildings are. A lot of people don't recognize that that's Mellon Park, but the edge of Mellon Park is actually Shady Avenue. So how do we make Shady Avenue read more permeable, make it more intuitive connections from Shady Avenue into the heart of the park, as well as these other buildings? And these are issues that came up that we're kind of terming as administrative issues, meaning we know there are issues that need to be resolved, but we can't necessarily resolve it through design. So the first one is the permitting process for fields and events. Right now, the fields are very difficult to permit. They're permitted all hours of the day, but when you're actually out there on site observing use, they're not used that much, as they're not used at the same level that they're permitted. And we believe the reason is just the way the permitting system works. people grab as much time as they can, and then they use it when they need it. And it's just the way the system works that encourages people to do that, or else be left without time. So it almost creates kind of an artificial crunch on field space. So how do we address that to actually maybe unlock these fields and let them be used more effectively and more freely and more fairly as well? But again, that's something we can't design with. It needs to be kind of administered or worked through, and, with how the city does their permitting process. Rules and regulation enforcement. Again, a lot of people said it's either rules and regulations are not enforced, or they're not enforced consistently, or they're enforced differently depending on the group that enforcement officers are interacting with. So how do we sort of make standard, regular rules that everyone can abide by? And do we need to even analyze the rules that we have in place to make sure that they make sense? Do rules need to be changed? Again, we can't design it. We can make suggestions as part of this action plan and recommendations, but it's not something we can design. And park conditions and maintenance. So a lot of people, thought that the conditions of the park, they needs better maintenance. Pathway conditions are poor. Planting is poor in some areas. Some of this we can control through design. We can make sure we can do things that make maintenance easier for DPW. We can certainly make sure we don't propose things that would be difficult for DPW to maintain. But what we can't do is design more funding, more capacity, and more resources for DPW to maintain the park at a high level. So it's a little bit of both. There are issues we know need to be resolved, and we'll make recommendations, but we can't control them through our design process. Before we jump into our proposed improvements, very quickly, are there any questions from the survey and kind of the public feedback that we just shared with you, or any thoughts before jumping in?
I guess I have a question about the permitting, because I am on a board of a local youth baseball league. And in your design process, you're talking about permitting, and that you can't, that's a different issue than design, which I totally understand. Yet you're going to be designing stuff which will then greatly affect the organizations. Like if you decide to take out a baseball field and put in a football field, that has a huge effect on the community organizations that use it. So how are those issues that are that you can't design, but yet your design is going to affect use? How are you dealing with that?
Right. So that's a good question. So like we mentioned, we can't design it, but we know it's something that needs to be resolved. So we're going to, as part of this process, we're going to be working with the city to improve some of these things that, it's really out of our realm, but it's something that we can make recommendations that the city can then follow. And I think along those lines, if we were to go with something like taking away a baseball field and replacing it with a football field, I think that the action plan would have to clearly state that that can only happen if we fix permitting, because it's, so that's kind of the nuanced aspect of this plan, that we're going to have to make recommendations. Some of those are going to have to be contingent on other things happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Oops. Anything else before jumping on? Okay, so moving along. So how do we take all that input, all those issues that were raised, and find solutions to them? So that's our challenge with this project, and that's what we're trying to do. But before we could come up with design solutions, the first thing we wanted to do is sort of develop what we're calling our guiding concepts. So how are all these various issues going to be resolved, but how do we organize all those proposals to do that? And address all the issues in a way that makes, again, a unifying vision for this park, make this park feel like it's a whole park instead of two separate parks. So this diagram kind of shows what that guiding concept is. So going on the south side first, one of the things we noticed about the south side when we did our site observations and analysis was when people come to the south side of the park, generally speaking, everyone tends to make their way up to sort of this central lawn area where the old Mellon estate used to be. And we feel it's a testament to the design that you intuitively go to the top of the hill where the house was, even though the house isn't there. And then once they're there, everyone tends to kind of filter into the different spaces that are connected to that central area. So whether it's the walled garden, the terrace garden, or this space here, this other kind of hilltop area, which is where the old fruit estate was. And we really liked how this space works as an organizing element for the park. It kind of creates this central kind of community heart or community open space, community gathering area. That's really serves as the heart of the park where everyone comes together before they go to these other spaces. And we think that's an important design aspect of this side of the park. And what we want to do is actually enhance that. So keep what works, but actually make it stronger and make stronger connections to some of the other areas of the park, especially some of these areas that weren't part of the original fruit estate, and make that connection. So when no matter what corner of the site you come in, you kind of make this natural progression to this community core. Flipping over to the north side of the park, however, there is no community core. It's a parking lot. It's a chaotic and fairly dangerous parking lot. So how do we create that same space? How do we create this community gathering space where everyone intuitively goes to, where everyone kind of intuitively gathers before going off to these very well-designed, well-connected amenity spaces around that? So those are the kind of the guiding principles for how we're going to implement our improvements. But we also need to connect the two sides of the park. That's another major issue that this project is looking to address. So there's two ways we're looking at doing that. The first is using water, or more accurately, stormwater, as kind of a connecting element or a connecting theme north and south of the park, primarily along Beechwood Boulevard. And there's a few reasons we want to do that. One, this is the historic location of Negley Run. So, and there's also already a lot of existing stormwater infrastructure along this run. And as you'll see later in the presentation, one of the goals of this project is to also manage stormwater and push the envelope in managing stormwater within this park, as it's a citywide issue, especially for Negley Run and the A42 sewer shed. So can we use water and stormwater management as a way to not only kind of tell the history of what this space used to be, like bring back that history of that this was a river, this was a stream that historically managed stormwater, but also to sort of physically do it with stormwater infrastructure and surface improvements, et cetera, to create this kind of connecting element that way. The second thing we're trying to do is make an east to west connection. And what we thought would be useful there is art. There's already a presence of art on both sides of the park. There's the existing sculpture art walk on the north side of the park here. And then there's a number of art installations on the south side of the park, namely some of the statuary and the design around the former Mellon estate, but also the Center for the Arts building and art programming being run out of this corner of the park. So can we use art to kind of just naturally connect these two halves of the park as well? Now, caveat on this, the big disclaimer is, we don't know, and this, at least as far as this presentation is concerned, what this art kind of connection is going to look like. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, art is very dependent on context and what's in and around it. If you took one of these sculptures that are existing on this art walk and you plunked it in the middle of the walled garden, it would have a very different feel and effect, and people would view it differently. So we kind of need to nail down some of the programmatic elements and the context in which this art is going to be infused in. So where are basketball courts going? Where are baseball fields going? Where's the parking lot going, et cetera? Which is what this meeting is focusing on. But once we kind of know how the context is going to be, we're going to work with community artists, community members, et cetera, to really sort of brainstorm, how can we infuse art and use art as a connecting element between the two sides of the park? So something to just keep in mind, keep in the back of your mind. We don't have answers for it yet, but it's something that's going to be woven into this process, probably in the next phase of design. So jumping into overall improvements, these are basically improvements that we are proposing for both sides of the park that we're kind of considering our base improvements. Meaning we studied various different options for some of these improvements, but these were by and large the best. And there really wasn't worth showing other options that created more problems than they did fixed problems. So what we're doing is we'll go into both halves of the park in more detail, but we're really just showing kind of these baseline improvements that are going to be the same no matter what other design options you select. But there are some areas, namely kind of the field and community space area, play area, terrace garden area, and the chicken coop area. That's kind of that squat white and green building that is very nondescript and is abandoned that some of you may be familiar with on the south side. We've come up with some design options where there are more options to consider that all have their own merit, and we'll explore those in a little more detail. So what we'll do now is we'll go through the overall park improvements. We're going to pause and break out to discuss those in a breakout session, and then we'll come back and discuss and present and discuss these more detailed option areas. So going to the north side of the park, the biggest change we're proposing here is how parking is handled and managed. So what we're proposing to do is actually flip the parking, take it out of this central heart of the park, flip it 90 degrees and place it in the current location of where the basketball courts and the play area are. What that does is allows us to do a couple things. One, like I mentioned, it takes parking out of the heart of the park and it tucks it up against this area adjacent to Fifth Avenue, which is not exactly a pleasant place to be as a park user anyways, but it also just makes sure that cars are out of the way and not intruding in the interior of the park and creating vehicular and pedestrian conflicts. It also allows us to expand parking somewhat substantially. So right now there's about 46 parking spaces that exist in the park today. This alignment would allow us to increase that to 71 regular spaces plus an additional 4 ADA spaces. So 75 spaces total, which is almost doubling the existing parking that's on there, not quite. But parking issues may still be problematic out there. This is a popular park, but this would do a lot to alleviate some of the day-to-day issues that we see happening on the site today. This parking lot is also going to be designed with pedestrian safety in mind and at the forefront. This is a parking lot in a park. It's not a parking lot at a Target. So pedestrians have the right of way. Pedestrians should be at the forefront of how this is designed to make sure it's pedestrian friendly and appropriate for a park setting. So it'll be a one-way circulation to make it easier for pedestrians to navigate. They only have to look in one direction for cars. There'll also be a number of raised crossings. And the intention here is that when you are on a sidewalk or a pathway within the park, you never have to get off of that pathway until you are physically going to your car or leaving the park entirely. Again, pedestrians have, precedent here. And also we're incorporating planting areas that make the parking lot greener, less hostile and harsh, make it more park-like, and also provide opportunity for stormwater treatment. The next big intervention we're proposing on the north side is actually rerouting the shared bike path. Currently, it cuts straight through the center of the park, and you either take a left and you head towards Shady Side. Oops, sorry about that, skipped ahead. Or you take a right and you can head up Penn Avenue and connect to the existing bike infrastructure on Penn Avenue and Bakery Square. What we're proposing is to actually bend that shared use bike path out and around the center of the park and line it up more directly with that existing infrastructure, that existing bike infrastructure that takes you to East Liberty, as well as extending a shared bike path along Penn Avenue to the corner of Penn and Fifth. There used to be a pathway here, we're fairly certain. People are certainly walking it. There's a desire line, there's a mud path going straight through here. Why not make that connection, make it sized appropriately that can accommodate bikes and pedestrians in the hopes that we could potentially facilitate a future connection to future bike infrastructure elsewhere. We're also proposing to upgrade Field 1. We heard pretty clearly on the survey that Field 1 is beloved. It's one of the only fields of its size in the city. So we didn't want to mess with that other than to make field upgrades, including better drainage, a warning track and fencing, a batting cage, etc. But really making this more of a premier field and upgrading it. It's as it's worn down over the years. And lastly, one of the major things we're doing on this side of the park is proposing naturalized planting areas. That could mean a lot of things. That could be meadow areas, it could be restored woodland areas, it could even be lawn areas that don't get mowed quite as often as other open space areas. And those would be located along the periphery of the park. The intention here, that there's two things. One, lawn, while technically permeable, does not do a great job of infiltrating stormwater. So if we can break that lawn down, reduce that lawn area, because there's a lot of it in Mellon Park, and a lot of it's not particularly usable. If we can reduce that lawn area, that helps, and turn it into more naturalized planting, that helps us from a stormwater management perspective. It also helps DPW from a maintenance perspective. If these are areas that require less maintenance and less care, that relieves some of the burden on DPW and would allow them to focus more on areas that we want them to maintain at a high level. And then lastly, and we'll discuss this a bit more in the presentation, but making this a special intersection, potentially painting this intersection or doing some improvements that alert drivers and pedestrians that this intersection is actually crucial for connecting two halves of the park and it needs to be treated carefully. But again, we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Jumping over to the south side, one of the main things we're trying to do in the south side of the park is integrate these buildings back into the park, and then increasing connections on Shady Avenue. Like we mentioned before, a lot of people perceive this to be the edge of Mellon Park, and it's not. So we need to actually do things that bring people from this end and make better connections to these buildings in general, and sort of weave everything back to the park and make sure that these spaces feel and read like park spaces. So a couple things we're doing to do that. One, again, we're reorganizing the parking strategy to make it a one-way drive. Again, the intention is this is a parking lot in a park. We want it to feel green. We want it to feel safe for pedestrians. So we're doing all the same things, including adding planting, adding raised crossings, to make this a safer connection point. The other thing we're doing is to try and beautify this area and address some of the issues in terms of how these buildings interact with the park. Right now, the current condition is you walk through a parking lot, you walk by dumpsters, you walk by loading areas, you walk by kind of the back of house parts of these buildings. DPW's maintenance yard opens up into the space. You can look right into their garage, etc. So how do we clean some of that up, reorganize it so that these connections that we're making feel more intuitive and more park friendly? So one of the major things we're proposing specifically on this side of the park is to reorganize the garden center entrance as well as the DPW yard entrance. So if you go to the park today, there is a cobble drive that's historic. It's the Mellon's historic cobble drive that went to their carriage house that runs along this edge of the property. What we're actually proposing to do is turn that drive into more of a maintenance access. We would take DPW's gate, we would restore the fence that's there, but we'd actually flip it, have it open on this side of the park, or this side of the maintenance aisle, to get that busy kind of in and out maintenance aspect of the park out of the main point of view. The other thing we're going to propose to do is to actually move the garden center entrance from its current location, which is here, which not a lot of people realize that's the main entrance to the garden center, and put it on the back side of the building here that actually faces the parking area where a majority of garden center users are coming from. And what that does, again, it does two things. One, it reorganizes the space. It makes these buildings feel like they're facing park amenities or facing park access. This would become the garden center loading area. So again, we're taking this drive and we're making it sort of the back of house working loading dock area that's tucked up against this edge of the property. And then the loading dock area that's here currently can be removed, and this porch area can be expanded, and additional kind of seating and lawn areas can be incorporated onto this edge of the park. So we're really reconnecting the garden center to the park. We're giving it a very clear front door, and we're moving all the maintenance aspects out of view. And then connecting this side, making more direct connections was another big thing we're proposing on this part of the plan. So that includes direct pathway connections into Mellon Park, making small openings in the existing fence here to get it into the core of the south side of the park, making better connections throughout this process. And we're also proposing new entrances to make this half of the park better connected. One would be on the location of 5th and Shady. There's actually some existing stairs from the historic entrance there now. We want to repurpose those and make this a new park entrance. An additional entrance would be on 5th Avenue, almost as close to the 5th Avenue Beechwood intersection as you can get. This entrance would line up with the historic driveway location of the Darcy estate, which is no longer here. But what this does is it allows people to cross 5th Avenue, and if they choose to come this way to enter the park, to get into the park as quickly as possible, because walking on Fifth Avenue is not a pleasant experience. We're also proposing to enhance some of the existing event spaces that are there. So enhancing this space here, maybe making some more seating areas where the old Mellon estate was previously located. This pathway here is actually the original front porch of the building, and this pathway connection here is the old hallway layout. So trying to make a better connection between the walled garden, which is a well-used space, and the terrace garden, which could be a better use space once it's improved. But we're also proposing a new pathway and seating overlook area at the old Frew estate. This could be, for the majority of the year, could have picnic tables and seating and just be a nice, pleasant place to gather. But when there are big events, this could be where a stage is set up. These pathways could be used to help park vehicles, staging, etc. And it gives us the opportunity to hold events in both locations or to rotate, maybe yearly, where events are held, to help protect the infrastructure that's here and avoid events kind of damaging what we have. And then lastly, on this side, what we're proposing are entry plazas at each location. We're proposing this in both sides, but these would be small, wide paved areas located on the park side of the fence that would have trash receptacles, bike racks, a bench, city standard signage that says Mellon Park, as well as perhaps providing a map of the area or some interpretive signage discussing the history of these spaces. And the point of that is to introduce typical park amenities, typical signals to a user who's walking by that this is a public park and I can enter that without having to slap a sign on a historic fence. So these are just some precedent images of how we want to do that. So this is an example of that gateway, that those entry plazas, how you could just use a few typical park amenities on the inside, the park side of this entrance. This is actually modeled after one of the entrances on Fifth Avenue that signal to a user that this is a park without having to do any signage or alterations to the historic fence itself. This is an example of that pedestrian-friendly parking lot. A lot of trees, a lot of planting, raised crosswalks, but really a pedestrian-centered, pedestrian-focused lot that's appropriate for a park. And these are some examples of planting and naturalized areas. So these could be, our planting beds within the parking lot, or other areas could be used for a stormwater function, like a rain garden, like you see here, or more naturalized areas could be meadow, they could be woodland, they could just be taller grass, etc. But removing lawn is generally the goal here. So switching over to traffic improvements. So one of the things we're talking about is how you got to get across Fifth Avenue, but does it make sense connecting people along Fifth Avenue, or does it make more sense connecting the two halves of the park along Beechwood Avenue? And there's a few reasons we're proposing this as an opportunity, because one, Beechwood Avenue, while people still speed on it, sees a lot less traffic than Fifth Avenue. There's also some existing open space we can connect to. And it just seems like inherently it's already a more pedestrian friendly it's a more enjoyable walking experience than Fifth Avenue. So we're going to use Beechwood, at least we're proposing to use Beechwood as the main connection piece between the two halves of the park. But there's definitely some things that need to happen to facilitate that. So this is just an image of the existing conditions on Beechwood there now. So at the intersection of Beechwood and Fifth, it's a very wide intersection. So there's a lot of pavement you need to cross if you're a pedestrian. You don't have a lot of time to do it. There's also no dedicated pedestrian signal. So if you push the walk button and you get the walk signal, cars also have a turning movement. So it's not very safe from a pedestrian standpoint. From a vehicular standpoint, it's not quite safe either. If you're coming out of the parking area right now, if you're sitting here waiting for the light to turn, you're actually facing oncoming traffic. So there's a lot of opportunity for confusion or vehicle-to-vehicle conflicts here. So addressing this is going to be part of the master plan, as well as Reynolds Street. This is a large, expansive paving. Reynolds just kind of has a straight run the way it's currently configured. So a lot of people either miss the stop sign entirely, or they pause at it, but they don't actually stop. I myself almost have been hit here twice while doing this project, trying to cross the street. So making this a safer intersection is also important. And as we mentioned, people speed on Beechwood, especially when they're coming down the hill towards Fifth Avenue. So how do we calm traffic? How do we make this a more pedestrian friendly and bike friendly roadway while also not sacrificing too much parking and still making it, safe to drive. So these are some of the proposed improvements we're proposing for this corner of Beechwood. So the first one and the simplest one is upgrading the signal to allow for a pedestrian only crossing phase, meaning if you push the button and it's a walk sign in all directions and no traffic gets to move. First and foremost, that would be huge for facilitating connections across Fifth Avenue, which is dangerous. The second piece would be realigning and reconfiguring this intersection in itself. So realigning the driveway access into Mellon Park North, so it actually lines up with the vehicular lanes opposite of Fifth Avenue. So it's just very clear for drivers and pedestrians where cars are coming from, but also necking down paving areas with bump outs where we can to shorten the distance that a pedestrian needs to cross when they are crossing the street. And also encourage people to go a little bit slower as the roadway narrows. The bigger change we're proposing is along this Reynolds Avenue, Beechwood Avenue intersection. We're actually proposing to turn Reynolds Avenue and make it connect to Beechwood Avenue at an actual T, perpendicular. And then again, bumping out the curb line and replacing that with green planting, potential stormwater management, but necking this down, reducing the overall pavement, making this intersection more clear to cars. So a car will stop, you can look both ways, it has good sight lines, and you can then make your turning. And then pedestrians have, again, less of an area to cross, and it just cleans things up and makes it a lot safer. We're also proposing speed humps, especially as you're coming down the hill, approaching Fifth Avenue. These are already getting installed all over Beechwood because people tend to speed on Beechwood. But we think that's important, especially in front of the park to slow down cars. And then again, where Lyndhurst Green connects Lyndhurst Green Street and Lyndhurst Road connects to Beechwood, doing bump outs here to connect to really neck that intersection down to make it safer for pedestrians to cross and to encourage cars to slow down as they approach this area. Additionally, as you move up Beechwood, these are some of the existing conditions. Beechwood is very wide. So, parking lane, the bike lanes, the travel lanes are actually the minimum that are allowed, but when they're all kind of stacked up together, it's a fairly wide road. So a lot of people go down it fast because it feels open. This right here is that existing crosswalk that I think was recently installed that lines up with Mellon Park Road or the Mellon Park Access Drive. Basically, this is a private residence, but this is sort of the end of Mellon Park as you go up Beechwood. But we know that approaching this area is key to making it safe for pedestrians. So some of the things we're proposing here, that crosswalk that exists, bumping out space and making that a raised crosswalk that kind of serves both purposes. It acts like a speed hump, it slows cars down, gives pedestrians kind of precedence or the right of way. And then also the neck down of the roadway reduces crossing width and also encourages cars to slow down. And then an additional speed hump as you approach the next pedestrian crossing. And then a little bit farther up Beechwood, again, where these roads come into Beechwood, bump outs, taking a parking lane or two that you can't park in anyways, converting that to green areas that can be used for stormwater. But all of these things help encourage cars to slow down and make pedestrian safety and access safer. And these are just some of the images of what we were just discussing. So that idea of a painted intersection, DOMI typically likes intersections to read the same all over the city. So same kind of language with the piano key crosswalks, stop lines, etc. And that makes sense because you want people to know exactly what they're supposed to do wherever they are in the city. We do feel that this intersection is a bit of a unique place. There are very few community parks of this size that are abutted by busy roads as dangerous as Fifth and Penn and Shady. So we think maybe some additional improvements such as a painted intersection, something that can be done artfully. We can incorporate art into this, but something to signal to drivers that this is different and I need to be cautious as well as pedestrians. This is an example of those bump outs we were talking about, reducing pavement width, adding green space that could potentially be used to mitigate stormwater. This is a raised crossing, kind of shows you how it works as a speed hump and as a safer pedestrian crossing. And this image really kind of shows that the intent of what we want to make Beechwood, make it this kind of green park road that's pedestrian friendly, it's bike friendly, and really kind of use that language to connect the two halves of the park. So you intuitively going from one or the other, that's the path you would want to use as a pedestrian. So now we're going to talk about stormwater and our stormwater approach. And I'm going to turn this over to Claudia to walk us through what we've looked at so far.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to start by zooming way out first. As I think a lot of you are probably aware, Pittsburgh has an issue with stormwater, flooding from stormwater, combined sewer overflows from stormwater that cause a combination of rainwater and sewage to be dumped into the river untreated when the pipes get overly full. And so this map is sort of showing our overall stormwater context. This the gray outline is the A42 sewer shed, or the Negley Run watershed. And so that's the sewer shed. That's the sewer shed that we're part of. And basically all water, stormwater, sewage in this area drains to a single pipe that discharges into the Allegheny River if the pipe is overly full. And you can see Mellon Park is this green area towards the bottom of the page, but the top of the watershed. And the orange area is the portion of the Negley Run, or A42 sewer shed, that is above the park, that sort of drains either to or past the park. And just to give you an idea of sort of how we fit into this system, the entire Negley Run watershed is about 2,862 acres, and the area outlined in orange on this map, which is the sort of the Mellon Park tributary sewer shed area, is about 220 acres. So that's a little less than 8% of the total land area. And then in terms of sort of what's going into the system overall, there's basically 5.7 billion gallons of flow into the A42 system, and that's about half sanitary sewage, and what we normally think of as sewage. And then the rest is either wet weather flow, which is the stormwater that hits our roofs and our streets, and then some of it is what's called infiltration, inflow and infiltration, which is basically our sewer system is old, it is leaky, in some cases it's made of bricks, and so groundwater sometimes finds its way into the sewer. But Mellon Park, which is the value shown in green, contributes about 58 million gallons of stormwater flow into the system, which is a little less than 4% of the total stormwater inflow into the Negley Run system. So you can see that we are a small part of the Negley Run watershed. So there's we can't solve the entire problem of combined sewer overflows in the A42 sewer shed with this project, but we can sort of try and do our part. And then the annual volume of combined sewer overflow. So that's when combined sanitary sewage and stormwater flows directly into the river untreated, is about 1.4 billion gallons a year, just for a little context. So if we look here, this is sort of a zoom in to that bottom area. So the larger, lighter orange line is the total Mellon Park tributary sewer shed, the 220 acres that we saw before. And you can see Mellon Park in green there at the top of the image, but the bottom of the hill. So we think that we can capture the smaller area outlined with the darker orange. So just topographically, we can potentially capture water that's running, down the streets and sidewalks in that area and capture it in the park one way or the other. And that represents, so the total big orange area is 220 acres. That smaller area that we think we can reasonably capture in the park is about 63 acres, and that translates to 27 acres of impervious area. And part of the reason that we sort of got into all of this detail is that as we start to think about sort of implementation of projects, organizations like Alcosan and Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority have programs for providing funding for projects, but the funding that is potentially available is tied to performance. How much are you helping me solve my problem? And so that's why we wanted to sort of understand what our contribution as this project would be to that larger storm shed, both because we want to do the right thing, but also because then it potentially is a way of seeking cost sharing on some of the improvements with some of the agencies responsible for management of stormwater. And so if we go to the next page, so this is, and let me just start off by saying, so any sort of improvements or modifications or stormwater strategies that we would employ in the park would be very much tied to the design of the park. So in other words, the design of the park, what people want for the amenities and the spaces is in the driver's seat, and sort of stormwater will be responding to those improvements. So since we haven't, and Brandon is going to get into a lot more detail in the second half of this about all of the improvements, the different options for improvements in these different areas of the park. But until we've sort of, narrowed down on some of the specific options for some of these areas, it's hard to say exactly what we'll do for stormwater. So I'm going to talk generally about a strategy. So if we look at this map here, so for example, next to the tennis bubble, we're proposing as a baseline park improvement, an improved parking area. While we do that improved parking area, we're going to dig it up and do that construction. Let's incorporate stormwater management into that. And that might be a combination of rain gardens to create those planting areas that Brendan showed in the precedent images. That might be porous pavement in the parking stalls. It might be underground storage, or it might be all of the above, or some of the above. And the same with the field. Brandon talked about sort of making improvements to field 1 for drainage and such. If we do that, if we make those improvements to field 1, we're doing improvements for drainage, that provides an opportunity to put underground stormwater storage underneath the outfield there as part of those overall improvements to the field. And that is also the natural low point of the site. So that's kind of where the water wants to go naturally anyways. In terms of some of the other areas, we are proposing to coordinate, creating stormwater storage and management in the places where we're proposing modifications. So again, over on the South Campus, we know we're going to be looking at reconfiguring some of those parking lots. That's a perfect opportunity, again, to do some stormwater infrastructure similar to what we're doing on the north side of the park. We've also sort of had conversations about, could we, create a cistern, a storage cistern on the south side of the park that would capture roof water that could then be used by the people who maintain the walled garden and potentially a future restored terrace garden. The other sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, is if we make some of these traffic improvements along Beechwood that Brandon was showing, with the sort of the bump outs and the smaller road area, that gives us an opportunity to create stormwater management in those areas. And then there are other options, and I'm sort of I don't want to sort of jump the gun on the different options, but there are, for example, different options about where to put the basketball courts. But if we're going to build new basketball courts, it makes sense to incorporate stormwater management there. So all of which is to say that we would be sort of the park amenities options that are sort of selected and brought forward in the final plan will dictate the final sort of layout and design of any stormwater management that we do. But we do have a goal in mind in terms of how much, the quantity, not necessarily where, how, but the size of that. And so we are looking at trying to provide storage distributed throughout the park of a little under 1.8 million gallons of stormwater. And that would translate into a couple of things. We would reduce the total annual CSO overflow by a little over 18 million gallons per year. We would also reduce the flooding volume annually by about a little under 1 million gallons a year. And then the sort of the flip side of holding back more stormwater on your site is that you actually end up sending you send less CSO into the river, that means you send more water to the treatment plant. So we're looking at, if we were to provide that 1.8 million gallons of storage, looking at sending an additional 17 million gallons a year to the treatment plant, which means that that water will be treated before it's released into the river, as opposed to being released untreated. That's it.
Thank you, Claudia. So we're going to take a 10-minute break to do some breakout rooms to discuss just the overall improvements, keeping in mind that we're going to show you options for how basketball gets worked back into these schemes and play areas, etc. But right now, we just kind of want to focus on our overall approach to the north side, our overall approach to the south side. What do people think about Beechwood? What do people think about our approach to stormwater? So we're going to break out 34 people.
Brandon, I was just going to note, there are a couple of questions that came up in the chat. Do you want to take those now, or specifically, there was a question about whether the hill on the south side can still be used for sledding with the proposed new pathways. There were a couple people that chimed in on that one. And then there was a question about the option of doing a roundabout at the Beechwood 5th intersection instead of a traditional crosswalk.
So the first one, yes, I think we're not doing anything to impede sledding. We're trying to leave that area generally open. And the second question about roundabouts, that I would have to defer to our traffic engineer, who is not on the call, but that's a good suggestion, and that's something we can look at in addition, kind of in this next phase as we refine our approach and see if that's something that's feasible. And if so, we will bring it back to you folks next time around. So yeah, I think we've got about 36 people. So I think we could, sneak peek. I think we can break into 3 breakout rooms and just sort of discuss sort of the overall improvements. And again, the goal is to tell us what you like, what you don't like, what are we missing, like a roundabout question. If you have any specific questions that your facilitators can't answer, that's fine. Just we'll put a pin in it and we'll discuss it when we come back in the big room together. So with that, Caitlin, can you break us out into groups? All right. And we will see you all in 10 minutes.
Brandon, it's not, I don't think I can, it didn't let me assign myself to a room. So I'm gonna see, right now I have Claudia and Catherine in one room and Aaron in another room. And I'm gonna see if I can pop into Aaron's room. I don't know if it's because I'm recording, it's not letting me.
That might be. Let's just run with it. If you can pop over there, great. If not, we've got facilitators in each room and Aaron can handle it. So maybe the best way to do this would be to kind of back up and maybe we'll start looking at overall improvements on the north side of the park. And anybody have any thoughts, suggestions, things they like, things they didn't like, etc., for what we're showing on this screen? Okay. Everyone
Hi,
loves
this
it.
is
I
Susan.
actually have a question.
Sure.
So I totally understand the need for additional parking spaces, but I am wondering what that may do in regards to the then added busyness of that intersection, where right now it's more or less just 3 ways that people are using their cars. But if you're doubling now the cars parking lot, could you potentially now see even now a slower traffic through that intersection, which maybe is also what you're looking for too, to slow it down. So that I could see as an objective too, but just wanted to know what you could foresee as maybe the potential of with adding parking spaces.
That's a good point. So yeah, to the first thing in terms of making it slower and safer, I think what we're proposing right now, everything is kind of joined. Pedestrians come in the same spot, bikes come in the same spot, cars come in the same spot, and they share the road. What this scheme would do is it would you know, if you're entering on a car, you would get sent off this direction. If you're entering as a pedestrian, you would cross the street and you can go straight. And if you're entering as a cyclist, you can cross the street and branch off to the right. So we're trying to sort of split the different modes that people come. To your point about, will more cars come here if we add more parking? During one of our initial analyses, we put a video camera on this intersection and just did a recording for 2 hours. And one of the things they counted was, this was during kind of the peak time when everyone comes to the park, it was either 60 or 70 cars entered and exited the park in a 1 hour period. And I think they counted 200 pedestrians coming into the park. So I guess the pressure is there. But if we can actually give people a place to park and then not kind of try and do a 3-point turn and chaotically, I think that's the other benefit of this layout too, is you're able to come in, and if there are no parking spaces, you can just safely loop out and exit, or you can come in and safely drop someone off and loop out and exit versus what's out there now, which is just a madhouse. All right. Anything else on the north side? Okay. If you think of something after, we can always jump back, but moving on to what we're showing. Oops, let's skip ahead. On the south side. Any thoughts, concerns, questions regarding some of the general baseline improvements we're proposing for this half of the park?
I have a question about the historical interpretation of the park. There doesn't seem to be as much emphasis put on that as there has been on user experience and water management. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, say, the area of the where the house used to be.
Sure.
What were those, the lines that the paths that you have there that represent the porch and the hallway through the house, were they also driven by desire lines, desire paths?
Yeah, in a way. So, I think two things. One, there aren't any worn desire lines. It's not like there's a worn mud line here. So that's not as much of an issue. But one of the things we felt when we were here was this space, while being open and green and great, it also kind of creates a bit of a void between these two really well-designed spaces. So what we thought could be strong as an element is let's kind of make that connection again. Let's reconnect those two spaces that were, connected by the house that is no longer there. And if we did that, is there a way we can do it that kind of interprets some of the historical elements of that house? So the front porch that could have seating and tables and be a gathering space, as well as a more direct pathway connection. All that being said, the space functions well on its own, and this isn't necessarily something we have to do if people don't think it provides value or if they think it kind of negatively affects the feeling of the space that's up there. Does that make sense?
It does. This was my childhood park, and it's also still my neighborhood park. And I have always wanted to see some more interpretation of the house and how it sat at the top of the hill and where the different parts of the house were located. And I think it was Barry Hannigan some years ago, maybe 20, suggested outlining the house on that field, on that the mount there. Is that something that has been considered or would be considered? That it would be outlined in Ligonier block or some other pathway that showed at the minimum the perimeter of the house, but perhaps also the interior spaces.
And that's something we can pursue if there's a lot of support for it. One of the things that this front porch that we're showing, that was actually included in the 2000 preservation and maintenance plan that Barry worked on, and that was one of the recommendations, was a little bit more of a direct interpretation of what was there, especially with this, the old porte cochere still being
Right.
there and potentially adding a shade trellis. The hallway connection was something we added to sort of advance that idea a little farther and make a more direct connection.
Mhm.
But to your point, a lighter touch, maybe just outlining where the house used to be and maybe where some of the spaces were. That's something we could consider too. And maybe that's the better direction to go. Because we have heard comments from the first two previous meetings that we had on Saturday that some people felt this was a bit intrusive, or
Yeah.
there's a lot of events here, and if you have a walkway cutting through it, that could kind of mess everything up
Mhm.
to a certain extent.
And there are other ways to interpret the existence of the house, creating a sort of plexiglass overlay that has a ghost image outline of the house that when you walk in front of, you can see where it used to be from that one vantage point. Are you familiar with what I mean?
No, I don't think I am.
Okay. At some historic sites, they allow you to stand in a certain place, and from that vantage point, there's a screen in front of you that rebuilds the house in a drawing on plexiglass.
Got it. Yes, I think I do know what you're talking about. Yeah, that's a very good idea, actually. And that could be incorporated in a number of locations in and around this park, especially with some of the other properties too.
Yeah. And what about the chicken coop options, please? What would they be?
We are going to dive into those after we all come back.
Okay.
So we'll get there.
Okay, thanks.
If I might just jump in for a second, and I think that's been a really good exchange that you all just had. I would just add that, at the master plan level, I think the goal is to show ways to approach a next stage of design. So I don't believe this particular path across the lawn is meant to be prescriptive. It's just one suggestion about
Right.
how our upper and lower gardens might be linked. I love your idea about the imprint of the house. I mean, the house plan itself is pretty amazing. And there are actually a lot of ways to, as you said, to visually suggest it. In fact, the paving that goes around the lawn was laid out fairly faithfully to the pavement that was around the original house, including the drive under the porte-cochere. So I think it's just, these are really great ideas and we should include them as options.
You could do a geophysical survey too that might show where the foundations of the house lie, if they're still there.
I believe they are, and I believe on when it's very, very dry weather, you can actually see it in the lawn.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
see those old edges.
Yep.
Anything else? We've got a few more minutes left, I think, before we come back together. Anything else on the south side, or do folks have anything they want to add about stormwater or Beechwood Avenue improvements?
I had a question actually on the other side, sorry, on the north side.
Sure.
What would happen to all of the picnic pavilions and things like that? Where would they go to?
So some of that will be covered when we dive into the option areas. We have multiple design options for these two spaces, and a lot of those amenities are included in there. So you'll find out in 5 to 10 minutes.
Thanks.
Is there anything?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Susan Petnich. I grew up right beside Mellon Park for, I don't know, 20, however many. My parents owned the house for, 53 years. And I grew up playing in that park, as a child with my siblings and everything. And now I kind of live catty corner across the street from Mellon Park. I didn't get to listen to 40 minutes of your presentation, which I'll go back to and listen to that. But I just wanted to say that I appreciate what you're doing and all the work that has gone into this so far. It looks to be amazing, and I don't have any, negative comments to say about anything or positive or anything to add to that. Just really want to thank you for what you're doing, for the park that I grew up in. I mean, I'm 61 now. My parents bought that house when they were pregnant with me. And so I have literally grown up in that park, like the other lady had said, just for 60 years. And now, I took my children over there to play. So I just want to say I appreciate, this is an amazing amount of effort and energy. And I love the fact that you're going to help the water situation, because my niece and her family lives in the house where I grew up. And for a long time, that water was rushing into their backyard and causing all kinds of problems. Some of that's been solved, but I appreciate the fact that water is a concern and that you guys are addressing that. That means a lot. Then just quickly, I don't really love speed bumps, but I do know that when I go to cross the street where I live at the corner of Beechwood and Beechmont Road, the people do come flying down Beechwood Boulevard. And I'm not sure why you called it Avenue, but maybe it was just a whatever. I think it's called Boulevard. But anyway,
Oh, yeah, you're right.
so, yeah. So I don't really love speed bumps. I don't love them on the upper part of Beechwood, but I know they serve a purpose. And so, my kids and grandkids will be safer. But really, it was just to thank you for all the work. I can't even imagine that went into this. So
Well, thank you. We appreciate the kind words. That definitely makes us feel good. And it's very cool hearing stories about people who grew up in this park and have an affinity and a love for this park being their community park. And I think there's a lot of folks in and around on both sides of the park who feel that way, which is something we've learned through this process about how important Mellon Park is to the city of Pittsburgh.
Thank you. A really quick story. You know what we used to do in those gardens, those walled gardens? We put our roller skates on and we would roller skate through there back in the 60s and the 70s, literally. And then we would get our bikes. That was our playground. And we would, roller skate and play. And then we'd play hide and go seek up there. And then my brothers would have his friends, his high school friends, down on the flat of Beechwood Boulevard right beside the house. And we would play baseball and softball. And if you got to hit it up into the garden, then that was a home run, obviously, because nobody could get it. So I could tell you story after story about how I've lived in that park all my life. So I love that it's going to get, refurbished and become new and loved. And I love the lady's idea of, the house was never there as far as I know, as far as I was there. So I'm 61. I don't think the house is ever, does anybody know what year that house was taken down? Because as far as I can recall as a child, the house was never there, but it could have been, I just don't remember. I think that's
It wasn't
wasn't,
taken down in the early 40s.
Okay.
43,
So,
right, Susan?
okay.
Yes, 23.
So I think that's a really cool idea to somehow have the print, some type of footprint of it. And, something to show you can see the house from, on the storyboard or whatever you want to say. I think that's a really cool idea. So, all right, I've talked enough. Our 10 minutes are probably up. Thank you again.
Thank you. No, we appreciate the feedback. Anything else, or Caitlin, do you think we're probably running up on time? We should bring people back in.
Yeah, I'll close the rooms and then people can filter back in.
Brandon, while that's underway, I was thinking as you were presenting about the perimeter of the entire park as an opportunity to sort of add a new layer that would be that unifying identity through the language of the entry plazas. And just starting to think about design kind of guidelines for that and looking to the existing materials in both sides of the park and thinking about should they be unique or should they all be the same? Should there be an element that's related to what they're close to that maybe is what an artist brings to an otherwise uniform language? So I think that'll be really interesting for you and the team to explore.
Yeah, definitely. That's something I've started thinking about in the back of my mind, as well as materiality, and do we use that to
Right.
bring people
Materials,
together?
planting, sort of a consistent palette that maybe is a real expression of the arboretum. So it's maybe that those entrances are entrances to the arboretum, which is the whole park. So I think there are just some wonderful opportunities for building on the identity of the park today.
Agreed. All right, do we have everyone back?
Yeah, I think everyone is back in here.
Looks like it. Hopefully, there was some good feedback. Any questions that came up in the other breakout rooms that people want to see addressed before diving into these proposed options?
Brandon, I think I did get the question about what's going on with FIPS and their sort of big plans.
Yes.
Yes,
So-
that. I said I was punting it to you.
That's fine. So it's uncertain at the moment. We have heard that FIPS, their lease was not renewed. It has expired. They don't feel confident it will get renewed. So there's that. Whether that means FIPS is out of the garden center forever, or whether it's just a subject that's in negotiation, we're still not sure. That was somewhat late breaking. But one of the things we're trying to do as part of this effort was a few months ago or a month ago, we had gathered FIPS, the city, Center for the Arts, and some of the other stakeholders around just to talk about the fate of these buildings. I mean, not the fate, but the future of these buildings. What do those organizations, what are their dreams and aspirations for how these buildings can be used, and how they can offer programming for the broader community? Because there's a lot of overlap on those goals. And then, all these leases are expiring. They need to be restructured. So we should base the restructuring of leases on that. I think one of the things this was a subject that came up in the last two meetings and has come up here as well. And what we're trying to do now is think of a way that we can facilitate not only that conversation between existing stakeholders, but conversation between you, the public. What do you want to see in these buildings? What you see their future and how they can serve the community as a whole. So we're in the process of trying to develop, it might be its own separate engagement process running parallel to this action plan process, but we definitely see that it's something important. A lot of people have questions, and we're going to try and see how we can resolve them the best we can. I think regardless of who is in those buildings, the improvements that we're trying to propose are generally meant to just reconnect those buildings into the park. So it doesn't really matter who's in them per se, but obviously it's an important element we need to consider as part of the design. So I wish I could give you more definitive answers. Things are still up in the air, but it is something that we are actively pursuing. Yeah.
Brandon, I pasted a couple pieces of feedback and questions in the chat here from my breakout rooms. So I'll read them out loud. The roundabouts. So it does not feel like this will make the intersection any safer because roundabouts are meant to keep people going. What is the reasoning for the roundabout?
So the roundabout was something that someone brought up as a suggestion. It wasn't part of our original design. We're going to look at that to see if there is any benefit to it with our traffic engineer, but there may not be. There may be a reason why we cannot do it, especially on a road like Fifth Avenue. I'm just looking at your other questions. 74 cars. Will it jam up if there's a big event? Having 3 smaller lots. So one of the things that's a good suggestion, something we looked at as well, as do we break up parking area? One of the reasons we didn't do that is, one, it just makes it a little, from a wayfinding standpoint, it's a little more confusing. You have to know which lot you want to go to dependent on your activity, and a lot of people might not know that intuitively. The others, we're really trying to minimize the amount of areas where cars can access the park. So we really want to sort of keep it centralized, similar to the way it is now. But in terms of the amount of cars that go in there, this question came up earlier during our traffic study. We actually put cameras at this intersection to count the number of cars and people that move through it. And on a busy day, on a like kind of one during peak hours, those hours between like 4 and 6, I think there were about 60 or 70 cars that were counted entering and exiting the lot within an hour, and about 200 pedestrians. So I think the crunch is still there and will continue to be there. One of the benefits that this parking lot design is trying to do is to simplify circulation. So rather than going in, seeing there's no parking space and having to execute a 3 or 5 point turn to get out, it's a one-way loop that allows you to just circle back out, which makes it easier and less chaotic. It also provides opportunity for people to just get dropped off in a safer condition, and then people can leave. So I think there's always going to be a crunch on parking. We recognize that. We don't want to cede too much green space to parking because this is a park and land is precious for park space. But between additional parking as well as trying to make safer pedestrian connections, bike connections, et cetera, that might encourage someone to walk instead of taking a car. Those are some of the things that we're trying to do to address the parking issue. A pedestrian bridge, we did look at that as well. One of the reasons we ultimately did not decide to go with a pedestrian bridge, well, there's a few. One, it's exorbitantly expensive, and we know cost is going to become an issue once we get to a later phase of this project. But the other thing that's difficult with pedestrian bridges between these two parks is the significant amount of grade change between the south side of the park and the north side of the park. Meaning if you wanted to enter on the north side of the park, cross traffic, you could potentially be having to walk up 2 or 3 stories in order to mitigate where you would connect. And one of the things with pedestrian bridges when they are actually installed around the country is if it's easier for someone to sprint across a road, even in unsafe traffic conditions, if it's perceived to be easier to do that rather than walk up 3 flights of stairs to cross safely, they're gonna take the risk. We should never underestimate the laziness that people can sometimes exhibit. And unless you physically cannot cross a road like a highway or you're facing certain death, people generally don't use pedestrian bridges if it's easier to just go the old-fashioned way. So those are why we ultimately did not decide to go forward with a pedestrian bridge. And last question, and then we do really need to move on to keep on schedule. Disturbing ground around trees, especially in terms of water abatement issues. So yes, that's come up in several different meetings, and that goes to the part that Claudia mentioned, that the idea between stormwater is we're not just going to do stormwater projects for the sake of stormwater. So we're not going to rip up trees and lawn and natural areas just to put in stormwater storage. The intent is to couple those things with improvements that we're already trying to do, like basketball courts, parking areas, baseball fields, etc. And our designs are intentionally siting those areas to avoid existing trees. So sort of by default, the stormwater storage aspect, stormwater infrastructure will be avoiding significant tree canopy, root zones, etc. If that makes sense to everyone. Okay, so let's move along. We can ask additional questions at the end. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So those are the overall improvements. And now we're going to dive into some of these areas where there are options for both. Sorry, this thing's a bit lagging. All right, so on the north side, if we were to move the parking like we're suggesting and expand the parking where the basketball courts, the play areas, et cetera, currently exist, we obviously need to find a home for those because the basketball courts are well used, the play area, the splash pad, et cetera, is well used. But we're also trying to create this idea of a community core or community gathering space in the center where people can come and congregate before using whatever uses they are or intended to use in the park. So this first scheme, option 1, looks at maintaining the amount of program and amenities that are currently offered, meaning we're trying to keep the same amount of fields, the same amount of courts, play area, etc. So what this scheme does is it proposes, if this is the connection across from Beechwood and Fifth, kind of elegant pedestrian entry with an entry plaza that could incorporate an art piece, but that's planted and intuitively draws people into the center of the park, where here we're creating this idea of that community gathering space. So that would have a new restroom and concession building with a shelter and additional picnic space and seating area, some additional cafe and seating area, terrace seating, and kind of a seat lawn area. So sort of an open space that people can come and gather for if they're here for a baseball game, if they're here for a birthday party, or if they're just here to have their lunch. But right now, that's sort of community space that's lacking on the north side. To do that, we would shift basketball to the location, essentially where the parking lot is now, both courts, and add some terrace seating into the hillside there to give an opportunity for watching games, waiting for the next game, etc. We're also proposing an overlook terrace where people can either sit at provided picnic tables or bring their own lawn chairs, et cetera, to watch a game. If you've been out there during a game on field one, you often see people kind of lining in lawn chairs along this interior walkway. But this area could also be used for events. You could put a temporary stage here and could actually have a concert or a performance where people gather in the field area and look up at the stage. So again, that idea of a performance space or an event space that's usable all year round, not just when there's an event. Additionally, we're proposing some additional picnic and shelter areas elsewhere in the park on this corner. And, the shelters are well used, they're well loved. And if we add additional ones, that can facilitate when there's a busy time of the park. So someone who's associated with baseball can use this shelter and permit it. This could be sheltered for people doing a basketball tournament or a birthday party, et cetera, but they're all connected. In terms of fields, we're still proposing the same number of fields, but we're actually flipping them. So right now, existing fields, there's a Little League field with a 200-foot center field in the middle, field 2. And then the field 3, kind of the upper field, is 175 feet to center. We're proposing to reconfigure where they're located and flip them. So this would be the 200-foot field, and this would be the 175-foot field. And what that does is it actually allows us to provide a little bit extra space to potentially incorporate a fenced-in, off-leash dog area. Now, it's not a large dog area. It doesn't meet the city requirements in terms of size, but it could be, if we can get a variance, we could provide something for off-leash for dog owners to take their dogs off-leash, whether they have large dogs or smaller kind of off-leash dog area for small dogs, but a place to go. Because, when the off-leash dog conflicts, dog users are just looking for a place to let the dog off-leash. And while it's not massive, it could provide an opportunity for that. And to keep in mind, too, that this could actually be very well designed, and we have a precedent image of it later in the presentation. It's not just a lawn area or stone dust area. You can actually incorporate trees, water elements, et cetera, to make this a more better experience, I guess, for dogs. So it's not just a kind of an open area where they can run around. The next option, field option 1, explores this idea, and this is, as someone pointed out earlier, if the permitting process can be rethought, if it can be redone in a way that makes permitting field space simpler, that makes more intuitive, if it makes it the ability to communicate to field users, if they're not going to use their field, they can let someone else know. But if there's a way to do it that kind of reduces this almost artificial pressure that we think is happening, is 2 fields enough? Is the large 90-foot diamond field 1 and a 200-foot Little League field, is that enough to support baseball on this half of the park? And if it is, if that approach checks out, can we convert the central field to a multi-use rectangular practice field? So it wouldn't be full-size football, it wouldn't be full-size soccer, but it would be a flat area that could be lined, that could facilitate team practices and kind of youth development, where they don't have to worry about getting booted off of a baseball field. They can actually go and practice. So that's really the only difference between these 2 options, something we want to consider if we can solve the permitting problem. But again, it's an if we can solve the permitting problem. And these are just some examples of what those improvements could be. This is an example of that overlook terrace that provides a vantage point for watching a game, but could also be converted into potentially a stage for performance events. Here's an example of a dog park that, again, it's not just an open field or an open stone dust area where dogs just run around crazy. It could actually be kind of carefully, artfully designed to to be more appropriate and more engaging for dogs in a park setting. This is an example of that terrace seating, kind of terrace lawn area we were talking about. But again, this idea of giving people a place to gather and spread out, and giving people a reason kind of to hang around that central community space. And an example of a combined restroom concession stand with a shelter space and some cafe seating to accommodate some of those uses that we need on this half of the park. So that's option one. Option two also looks at this idea of reducing a field, but for a different purpose. In this sense, if we were able to reduce this field and upgrade it to maybe make it a 200-foot field, maybe a premier field. So, one of the comments we heard was, these fields, a lot of people are embarrassed to play on the city fields versus playing in the suburbs. Can we, if we're not going to do two fields, can we really make this a premier field where Little League kids can, feel proud to call this their home field? And by taking a field away, does that give us an opportunity to create what we're calling the community green? So a larger open space, green space, similar to what you see on top of the south side of the park where the old Mellon estate is. These are actually, it's almost similar, it's very similar in size. Could that also have a shelter or stage that could be used to as like shelter seating area, or also for event space? And again, terrace seating, but this idea of creating a place where people can come and hang out and spend time. Basketball would be located in this location. And again, you could have a shelter, a picnic area associated with it, as well as some planting areas. These two little planting spaces here are actually the size of pickleball courts. It was mentioned, although not overwhelmingly in the survey, that pickleball might be something we want to see here. So in this scheme, there is an opportunity to accommodate pickleball if that's something that the public really wants. And then a much smaller and much more informal practice field area where it's just a level area where kids can, if it's cheerleading or youth soccer or football, there's a location they can practice here, and even to some extent, the community green itself. A larger expanded restroom and concessions building that might also be able to house an office for a public safety officer. So there's a continued public safety presence on site, rule enforcement, et cetera. A plaza / water play feature. The idea being that this is not like a typical splash pad. It would be in-ground fountain jets that might have a light display, something that is more artful or better designed, that's attractive or provides benefit to everyone, but it's something that kids can also and are encouraged to run around and splash and play in. It could also be shut off to accommodate events like a farmer's market or food trucks, et cetera, and service plaza space. And then this idea as you enter the park of this kind of community cafe space, which we have a good precedent image, but shelters, tables, maybe some string lighting, but something that's just a really cool, inviting place that people want to naturally hang out in and gather in. So this is an image of that kind of cafe space that we're talking about. That's just, maybe there's movable seating, but that's that idea of community. That's the space that greets you as you enter the park. This is an image of what a premier field could look like with some terrace seating and upgraded amenities, but something that's a little more than the typical city field that you see around here. These two images are good examples of that community green and how it can be used as sort of multi-purpose informal practice area or a play area, but can also facilitate a larger community event. The other aspect that we need to discuss is the play space. So if we put the parking where it is, we need to find a home for play area. And two of the ideas they're similar, but we're looking at this area, the area of the current sculpture walk. On top of the hill, that open lawn space, can we utilize that to create a play space that's really more family oriented, more kid friendly? Kids can run around in this area and not have to worry about getting hit by a bike or a car or a basketball game interrupting their fun. So what this scheme is proposing is to relocate the play space here The idea being to kind of tuck it in and amongst the existing canopy trees that are there and kind of create this idea of like a children's grove. Maybe the play structures are more vertical in nature to give kids the opportunity to get higher and almost feel like they're in and amongst the tree canopy, like a tree house. But by adding play value up, we actually able to reduce the overall footprint horizontally, which helps mitigate potential tree root impacts. The splash pad could also be incorporated up here, but with some additional play elements. Maybe it's a nature themed splash pad. Maybe it incorporates some other water play elements rather than just water jets and dumping buckets. Additional seating areas located around here for seating opportunity for families, and some additional shelter space, expanding that shelter area. So multiple parties can be held at the same time or one large group. But the idea being here to really activate the space through play. So not only this lawn area becomes more attractive for kids to run around in because they don't have to cross traffic to get to it. It's just connected to the play area. And these are some examples of what that could be. So this is an example of an enhanced kind of splash pad that has your typical ground features, your dumping overhead features, but also some other water play elements. Like this is a water gate that kids can turn and they're allowed to manipulate the amount of the water levels. They can flood it or they can open it and let water drain out with some other natural materials that they can interact with. These are two examples of more vertical play structures that get kids up. They provide height, they get them into the tree canopy. And they could be more natural themed like the one you see here, or more contemporary and kind of cool artistic features here that could play into the art piece that we're trying to determine later on. The second option for the play area, again, keep trying to utilize this area, but perhaps in this option, coupling the play a little bit closer to what we're calling that community core, recognizing that parents often have children of multiple ages. They might be here for a baseball game for their 9-year-old and have a 3-year-old that wants to play around the playground, and being able to be kind of in the middle of both of those things is important from a parent perspective or a multi-generational perspective. So this concept shifts the play area kind of over to this corner and actually utilizes the existing slope as a play feature. So it would be embankment play is the driving theme here. So embankment slides, climbing elements, it's the topography we have. It is the play element. It does provide challenges for kids, so let's utilize it to our advantage. In addition, this could be coupled with that plaza / water play feature that it is play. It is play, but it doesn't necessarily read as playground. And really leaving this lawn area similar to what it is now, because it is a nice passive open space, albeit a little underused. But what we're proposing to do here is adding some circular kind of bench seating in and around some of these really mature, really great specimen trees. Mellon Park is a designated arboretum, and there's a number of great tree species that a lot of people don't realize are there. And what this circular benching would do, it provides seating opportunity for individuals or groups that provide, overlooks looking down to Bakery Square, but it also encourages people to just sit under some of these beautiful trees and maybe interact with them or just sit and contemplate and really play up the contemplative nature and the passive nature of this area. And here are some examples of what that could look like. Here are two examples of embankment play, but play does not have to be your typical post and platform structure. It can be incorporated into a hillside and provide as much or more play value. This is an example of that plaza / kind of water play element where it's something artistic, it's something that everyone has aesthetic benefit, but it's also a play element. So kind of that dual purpose hybrid space, or it could just be turned off and used to host an event. And here's an example of that circular kind of bench seating that could be underneath some of these large canopy trees, but really encouraging people to sit in this space and interact with some of the, the natural beauty, the natural resources that Mellon Park has that make it unique. Moving on to the south side, and I'll try and make this quick so we have time for discussion. The terrace garden, options for the terrace garden. So one of the things we're proposing is to restore the terrace garden completely to kind of its historic integrity. And this was proposed in the 2000 treatment and maintenance plan. And we think that proposal has a lot of value because a park like Mellon Park is unique. Not many places in the city or in the country for that matter have these existing garden spaces that were once private residences that have managed to survive to this day. And the walled garden was restored in 2010, and it's a beloved space now. The terrace garden deserves that as well, and would serve as a great anchor between this community open space. It really would be a complement to the walled garden. So that would include restoring the brick walls, restoring the brick pavers to their original pattern, restoring the historic planting, at least based on the maybe making some modifications based on shade or changes in climate, et cetera, but really bringing back that terrace garden to its original design intent. And another thing we're exploring is this idea of stormwater storage that Claudia mentioned earlier. There's some gaps in the existing trees here. Is this a location that's at the bottom of a hill where some stormwater storage could be implemented that wouldn't affect tree canopy, et cetera, tree roots? And if we were to do that, excavation, could we level this flat area out just a little bit more to make it more conducive as an informal recreation space or an informal practice space? So if there is a lot of field pressure on the north side, could a cheer team or a youth soccer team come over here and set up their cones and just do their practice as an open lawn area? That some of that occurs now already, so this would just be a minor modification to facilitate it more. It wouldn't be necessarily a full-fledged field, if that makes sense. Another option. Come on. What if we don't restore the historic garden to its natural or its historic design? What if we rehabilitate it and update it for more contemporary use? So in this proposal, we would we would reconstruct it, we would rebuild it, we would respect the original design character, the size of the spaces, the layouts, et cetera. But maybe we don't restore it with brick or with planting. Maybe it can be event lawn spaces geared towards really smaller scale events like yoga in the park, or potentially a small wedding or a garden party, et cetera. And the idea here being is a lot of people mentioned that events were important or popular in the park, and it's something they want to see. And they certainly happen, and they happen in the walled garden. But what we want to do is protect some of these investments. We don't want to overuse the walled garden. We don't want to overuse this portion of the park where the former Mellon estate. So is it appropriate to offer another event space where some of those uses could take place, and that just it provides more flexibility and also protects the investments that we have now from damage? If we were to do that, are there other historic elements that we can restore and bring back into the space? So one of the ideas is restoring the old historic Olmsted Pond. There was a pond here. It was a frog pond as part of the Mellon estate. It no longer exists. Can we bring back that pond, bring back that design, but again, upgrade it to a temporary or contemporary use? Can it be used to treat stormwater? Can it be more of a rain garden with some stormwater treatment, some open water areas that keep the design intent, but update it for what we need today? Also, the idea of restrooms. This building here is the location of the old children's playhouse that the Mellons used to have on their estate for their kids. Can we make a small, either single occupancy or double occupancy restroom that is site appropriate, that takes inspiration from that design of that building, but provides a contemporary use that the south side of the park needs? And these are just some examples, some precedent images. So if this was a more accurate historic restoration of the terrace garden, this is a historic image. This is the type of design we would be trying to bring back from the Mellon estate. Or could it be more of a rehabilitation for a contemporary use like this image here, where the bones of the historic design are maintained, but it's updated for modern use. Maybe it's an event lawn, et cetera, geared towards smaller events. This is an example of the frog pond, just to give you a sense of what that space looked like. We would upgrade that again with rain garden plants and make it more of a stormwater function. And this is an image of a restroom facility that we're kind of calling a site-appropriate restroom facility. When we think of restroom buildings in parks, we think of what you see on the north side, quite frankly, which are cinder block buildings with ugly roofs that are very function only and utilitarian in their design. What this image shows is, public restrooms can actually be somewhat tastefully done, and we can do it in a way that takes inspiration from the original building and just makes it attractive and appropriate for the historic context which the building is cited. And moving on to the chicken coop, we'll do it really quick. So for those of you who don't know, this is the building that's the chicken coop, that squat building we talked about earlier that's been abandoned for a long time. This was the original working garden area for the Mellon estate. They actually had agricultural garden and display gardens in this location, and this building was sort of their working garden building. It facilitated the gardening that was done here by the Mellon staff. So what this scheme is proposing is to bring that historic element back to life. So the building itself would be renovated and become a working garden building again. The agricultural and display gardens would be brought back. The design would take some inspiration over the other garden spaces in terms of form and function. But to bring that working element of a working garden or a display garden back into the park. And one of the opportunities here is we did that. There are a number of programs and initiatives in the city to help neighborhoods that are food insecure neighborhoods, where they either teach people to either grow food for communities that are food insecure or going through those issues, or they can teach people how to garden, how to grow vegetables themselves. If we were to bring this garden back, could this be a location for those programs to be run out of, and help the greater Mellon Park neighborhood, Mellon Park community from this location, and encourage people from, again, all different uses to utilize this space. The next option, again, is this idea of, does Mellon Park need an additional event space to help protect some of the event spaces and the well-designed spaces that it currently has? So this is another option for where an event space could be located. Could the chicken coop building be completely remodeled to offer a restroom facility, as well as a public safety office for a public safety officer? Could the center portion of the building, the walls get knocked out, so it's more of an open air shelter where there could be picnic tables and seating and cafe areas, and make this a seating and gathering space? And then could a smaller event lawn be designed with some garden spaces around it to take some of the pressure off the walled garden, to act as a complement to the walled garden and the other event spaces that are on site, and really geared more towards those smaller scale events, yoga in the park, weddings, etc. And these are some examples, some precedent images. These two images do a good job of showing the same space, but used for different purposes. This is more of a working garden. This is more of a display garden, but I think it does a great job of showing that a working garden, a working agricultural garden, can actually be tastefully designed and beautiful and appropriate for the historic context that Mellon Park has on the south side, as well as a display garden like you see here. This is kind of an example of how that existing chicken coop building could be remodeled in order to provide a restroom, a office space, and some seating areas that's covered. And this is an example of kind of the feeling of that event space. Very simple, very low key, something that can host events and not overshadow the walled garden, but really just be a complement to the walled garden. So this is 20-minute discussion. It's almost 8 o'clock. We can do breakout rooms, or we can just have people shout out questions and comments in the open room. We want to be respectful of people's time. I'm more than happy to stay late, but it's getting late in the evening. So I guess with that, I will turn it over.
We're down to 23 people, which is less than what we had before. I might suggest that we stay in the large room, and that folks can definitely use the chat to put their thoughts and preferences while there's some discussion going on. Erin, your hand's up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we should stay in the larger group. And then I think that any questions that are asked right now, we can summarize for the notes. And also, obviously, we're recording the meeting. So folks that have to jump off can do so, and then maybe check back at the recording if they'd like to.
Yeah, and one last thing before we take comments is we're developing a survey that should be live next week that shows all of these concepts and provides opportunity for additional feedback. So if you want to jump off, but you have specific thoughts that you want us to know, we'll be sending an email blast with that link. It's going to be on the Engage PGH website sometime next week. So that's another opportunity to get feedback without having to hang on. So with that, we'll open the floor to people's thoughts, what they liked, what they don't like, what we're missing.
I have a question,
Good to
Mr.
see you.
Susan. What's the timeline that you're thinking of?
For
This whole thing? I'm excited. Let's do it.
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of it's going to come down to funding. I mean, this is a big project. It's a big
Yeah.
park. So I mean, realistically, that we could see this being finished in 20 years if it's a priority. The goal of this thing is going to be, after we identify what improvements we want, prioritizing which ones need to happen first. So which ones are going to have the maximum benefit, which ones are the greatest need based on what the community recognizes, et cetera. So we're not at that point yet. That's, once we get a preferred design, we can start having those conversations of what do people want to see first, what's more important, and have people rank improvements. But yeah, it's master plans take a while, but this is the first step.
Okay, thank you.
And then Ellen's hand has been raised.
Okay, Fiona has the first question.
Will you move the frog statue to a frog pond?
The frogs, absolutely. That's definitely something we should bring back. It was a historic element that the Mellons liked and their kids liked, so we would love to bring that back.
Okay, and Adair also has a question.
How big would the openings be in the fence which connects the area which has the buildings to the part which doesn't have the buildings?
Good question. So they would probably be 5 to 6 feet, just enough to get a pathway through. So we don't want to take all the fences down because they're historic, but we do just want to make some small gaps so people can move through. That makes sense.
I'd just like to say that I really liked the idea of restoring the terraced garden, restoring it into its, fixing it up the way it used to be. But I also like the idea of the pond. If it's gonna be historically correct and a way to mitigate the water, then it seems to me like that would be a good compromise between the two, so that those walls are so lovely and so gorgeous that I really would hate to see them be replaced or changed.
That's great feedback. And that's another good point too, is there is no either or. I mean, we presented some concepts with different ideas to get people's preference, but if you like things from both, then we'll include both, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments? I can't see if people have hands raised.
I thought the idea of flattening out that space by Beechwood, which I think is where that pond could either be a flattening out or put a pond. That's an interesting use of space. I know when we met in person, we were talking about, do you think of the north side as pretty much the organized play area, and the south side as, sort of the park where you go for quiet contemplation or whatever? It's an interesting way to sort of pull people that maybe wouldn't go to the south side park into it. But at the other side, it might, I guess I don't know whether you want to, I guess you're trying to unify the two parks. So that might be good, but it also might disturb, I guess, some of the people who go for quiet contemplation in the walled garden, but it does seem like a great use of space.
Yeah, those are both good points. I think it would help unify, but there could be conflicts with other users for the exact points that you mentioned. And I think it's up to folks to tell us if that's something they're comfortable with or if things should be kept separate.
Brandon, there's a hand raised from Elizabeth Siemens.
Hi, Brandon. I think that the whole question of adding event spaces on the south side of the park is something we should think about very, very carefully, because green space is not empty space, and unprogrammed space is not just waiting for something to happen in it. I think that this Mellon Park is already one of the most intensively used parks in the entire city. And if there are needs for more event spaces, it's not clear why they should all be put in Mellon Park. If people want to have lovely wedding venues and stuff, there's a lot of park space available in the city of Pittsburgh. And I think just because there are some lovely places for events, in Mellon Park, it doesn't mean, and because people enjoy them, I think that logically it doesn't mean like, let's make more of the same. I think we should remember that the contemplation and the quiet that people seek in nature is something that is very, very rich and that really is worth protecting. And I also know that the city, as we found out very sadly this weekend, is that the city's permitting, you know, you might think you were saving the walled garden by adding event spaces, but you might find that the city that does the permitting just will rent more and more event spaces. So I just think we need to remember that solace of nature is something that is very, very rich and important. And it does not, we do not necessarily need more programming. Thank you.
Those are very well heard and well appreciated comments. And I think one thing to keep in mind too is not necessarily, the goal is not necessarily more event space, but maybe better functioning event space. We know, for instance, this past weekend, like you're referring to, Elizabeth, there was an event that did some damage to the, I think it was mostly where the former Frew estate was. So more events could be a bad thing for the park because it encourages more use and more wear and tear. And we fully understand that. But if that space had been designed in a way to accommodate events, you know, where the city could permit it and say, okay, this is where you can set your stage. This is where you can lay down your equipment. This is where you can park vehicles. We have reinforced lawn areas here. And like, these are the rules. And this is how your event should be set up. I think that's more kind of where our thinking is headed, is how do we, events happen, people like events. How do we do them better in a way that allows that use to continue, but protects the park and park investments? Does that make sense?
It does, but I encourage you to if you know, festivals like the one that was in the park this year, there's really no reason on earth why that shouldn't be in Highland Park or Frick Park or some other park. It does not need to be in Mellon Park.
Yeah, and that's fair. And that's another piece that, you know, now we're talking about those things that we can design to a point, but some of it's at, you know, an administrative issue. I don't believe there's a cap on the amount of events that can happen in Mellon Park. So next year it could be double for all we know. So that's part of what we need to consider is this process too, is how are events permitted? How many should be permitted? Do we need to permit spaces? You know, do we need to have rotating event spaces? So in 2021, we're going to do events on the Mellon estate. 2022, those same events will move to the Frew estate location and give the Mellon estate location a break. All part of the conversation, and it definitely, to your point, Elizabeth, warrants much deeper thought and consideration to find that perfect balance between, you know, infrastructure to support a program, but also making sure that that program is regulated appropriately.
If anyone can do it, you can, Brandon.
Thank you. I appreciate your confidence.
Susan has her hand raised.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I 100% agree with what Miss Elizabeth Seaman said. And I think you just summarized it all beautifully. Thank you. And I believe that Brandon can get this done for us, for us, not just me, for us, meaning the community. So thank you again.
There's a couple more hands raised. Ellen and then Aaron Tobin.
Adair has another comment.
I like the tall structure, which is supposed to go up in the trees because it makes you climb more, and climbing is good.
Thank you. I agree. Those are way more fun. We appreciate it.
I'm just going to jump in with a quick time check. It's 8:08 and I see that Mary is Mary Rawson is raising her hand. Maybe this could be one final comment. Please put questions and comments in the chat as well.
I lost my connection there for a while, so I've missed all the brilliant things that people have said in the past few minutes. So I hope to catch up with those later, but I just wanted to say thank you for all the good work that this presentation has represented. And I know it's a process that's going to go on, but I really appreciate your care and thoughtfulness. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate hearing that. That definitely makes it worth it for us. So we hope to continue the good work for all of you and make this a place you guys love, even more so than you already do. Aaron Tobin, your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to say ditto to all of you because we couldn't do this work without community members coming out and giving us the feedback. And I know that there has been some feedback that people did not hear about the meetings early enough or didn't know they were happening or that this process was happening at all. And I just want to ensure folks that now that they're here, please continue to engage with us and tell us what your feedback is. And also, please let us know if there are other ways that we could be doing outreach to get more people to these meetings because, you know, there's only so much time in the day, but we really would love to know more about where we can be connecting with folks. So please let us know. And as Brandon was talking about earlier, we will be putting out another survey and I will put all of our emails in the chat and you should feel free to reach out to us with any comments or questions that you have moving forward. And just thank you everybody so much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you.
Real quick, is it possible to get a copy of the presentation today?
Yes. We're going to be posting it to the Engage PGH website either this week or next week.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah,
that's
if
fine.
that
Thank
works,
you.
I'd be happy
That's
to
more
send
than
it to you
sufficient.
directly, but
Thank you, sir.
yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. That was a long presentation. We appreciate you being with us and all the feedback you provided. And we hope to hear from you again in the next phases of this project.
Thank you again.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Good night.